A man can survive losing almost everything, but losing his honor is a different kind of pain. The community center smelled faintly of coffee, polished wood, and fresh rain carried in on jackets from outside. Folding chairs filled the hall. American flags stood beside the stage. Veterans, families, business owners, and local residents gathered for the annual fundraising dinner supporting former service members in the county. Warm light hung from the ceiling, reflecting off framed photographs that lined the walls. At the center of the room sat Ethan Brooks. The retired Navy SEAL preferred a seat near the back. He always did. Attention had never interested him. Recognition made him uncomfortable. At 45 years old, Ethan carried himself with quiet discipline. His short military haircut had begun showing traces of gray. Deep lines around his eyes revealed years of experience, hardship, and long days spent outdoors. Beside his chair lay Ranger, a sable German shepherd whose amber eyes calmly followed every movement in the room. The dog remained relaxed, yet alert. He noticed everything. The evening began normally. The mayor welcomed guests. A local band played soft country music. Volunteers moved between tables collecting donations. People laughed. Glasses clinked. Stories flowed freely. Ethan mostly listened. Occasionally someone stopped by to shake his hand and thank him for his years of service. He always responded with the same modest smile and a quiet nod. He never talked much about his past. Most people only knew fragments. That was how he preferred it. Then the speaker announced a special moment. Several local veterans would be recognized for their contributions to the community. Applause filled the room as names were called one after another. Eventually, Ethan's name echoed through the hall. The crowd responded warmly. Some people stood. Others smiled. Ethan looked uncomfortable as he rose from his chair. Ranger immediately stood beside him. Ethan rested a hand briefly on the dog's neck before making his way toward the stage. The applause continued. Then it stopped. A chair scraped loudly against the floor near the front of the room. Every head turned. A man in his late 50s stood abruptly. His expression was hard. His voice carried through the hall before anyone could react. That man should not be standing on that stage. Silence fell instantly. Ethan stopped walking. The speaker froze behind the podium. The room seemed to shrink. Why? Someone asked from the crowd. The man pointed directly at Ethan. Because he is not who he claims to be. Murmurs spread through the audience. Confused faces turned toward Ethan. Ranger's ears lifted immediately. What are you talking about? Another voice called out. The man stepped forward. I am talking about his Navy SEAL story. I do not believe a word of it. The silence became heavier. Ethan remained motionless. I think he lied, the man continued. I think he built his reputation on a story that never happened. Gasps rippled through the hall. People exchanged nervous glances. Some looked at Ethan. Others looked away. The mayor attempted to intervene, but the damage was already done. Doubt moved through the room faster than any explanation could. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Ethan stood quietly beneath dozens of eyes. He could feel the weight of every stare. Some were sympathetic. Some were uncertain. Some were already judging him. Ranger never took his eyes off the man making the accusation. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, focused, watching. The man continued speaking. He questioned Ethan's service record. He questioned stories people had repeated for years. He questioned awards, accomplishments, and memories most of the town had simply accepted as truth. Nobody knew what to say. Finally, all eyes returned to Ethan. They expected anger. They expected denial. They expected a defense. Ethan gave them none. He looked across the room calmly. His expression never changed. The silence stretched longer. Then he stepped down from the stage. No speech. No argument. No explanation. Just silence. Ranger immediately moved beside him. Together they walked through the rows of chairs. The crowd parted as they passed. Ethan could hear whispers beginning already. Questions. Doubts. Speculation. The wooden doors opened. Cool evening air rushed inside. Ethan stepped into the rain-soaked night without looking back. Ranger followed closely at his side. Behind them, the community center remained frozen in stunned confusion. Ahead of them stretched an empty parking lot glistening beneath streetlights. Ethan paused beside his truck and stared into the darkness beyond the town. For the first time in years, he felt something heavier than loneliness settling onto his shoulders. Inside the building, people were already deciding what they believed. And somewhere behind those windows, a single accusation had begun changing everything. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as Ethan drove through the dark streets toward the edge of town. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement like broken ribbons of gold. Ranger sat quietly in the passenger seat, his amber eyes fixed on the road ahead. Neither seemed eager to return home. The silence inside the truck felt heavier than the storm outside. Ethan had experienced difficult days before. He had faced hardship, uncertainty, and loss. Yet something about what happened that evening felt different. It was not the accusation itself. It was the look in people's eyes after they heard it. Doubt, suspicion, hesitation. The kind of doubt that spreads faster than truth ever can. 20 minutes later, the truck rolled onto a gravel driveway leading to a small cabin surrounded by pine trees. The porch light glowed warmly through the rain. Ethan stepped out and walked toward the front door. Ranger followed closely beside him. Inside, the cabin felt quiet and familiar. A fire still glowed faintly in the stone fireplace. Framed photographs lined a shelf near the wall. Fishing trips, mountain hikes, community events. Pieces of a simple life built over many years. Ethan removed his jacket and hung it beside the door. Then he sat heavily in an old wooden chair near the fire. Ranger immediately settled beside him. The German shepherd rested his head across Ethan's boot. For several minutes, neither moved. The crackling fire filled the room with gentle sound. Finally, Ethan reached down and scratched behind Ranger's ears. The dog closed his eyes briefly. It was a small gesture, but it carried more comfort than words ever could. Across town, however, the evening was far from over. Conversations continued long after Ethan left the community center. People gathered in parking lots, restaurants, living rooms. Questions multiplied. Some defended Ethan. Others repeated the accusation. Nobody seemed certain what to believe. By morning, the story had already spread through nearly every corner of town. Ethan discovered this the next day. He stopped at a local diner for breakfast as he often did on Saturdays. The moment he entered, the atmosphere changed. Conversations quieted. A few people nodded politely. Others looked away. One table fell completely silent as he passed. Ethan ordered coffee and sat near the window. Ranger lay beside the booth. Normally someone would stop by to talk, ask about fishing conditions, discuss weather forecasts, share stories. This morning nobody approached. The absence felt louder than any insult. Through the window, Ethan watched rain clouds drift across the distant mountains. He never touched the newspaper sitting on the table. He already knew what people were saying. After breakfast, he paid his bill and left. Outside, Ranger remained unusually alert. The German shepherd scanned every face they passed, every vehicle, every movement. Something about the dog seemed different since the previous evening. More focused, more observant. Ethan noticed it, but said nothing. The day continued. Hardware store, grocery store, gas station. Everywhere he went, the same pattern repeated. Curious glances, quiet whispers, lingering stares. By afternoon, the isolation had become impossible to ignore. Ethan returned home and spent several hours splitting firewood near the cabin. The repetitive work helped clear his mind. Ranger stayed nearby, watching from beneath a pine tree. Occasionally, the dog would stand and scan the surrounding woods before settling down again. As the sun lowered behind the mountains, Ethan stacked the final pieces of wood and sat on the porch steps. Cool air moved through the trees. The valley below glowed beneath soft evening light. Ranger joined him. Together they watched the landscape in silence. Ethan thought about defending himself. He thought about gathering documents, calling people, arguing his case. Yet every time he imagined it, something stopped him. The truth remained the truth whether people believed it or not. Deep down he knew that. Beside him, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood forward. His gaze locked onto the road leading past the property. A dark pickup truck slowly rolled by. The driver glanced toward the cabin before continuing down the road. Ranger remained focused long after the vehicle disappeared. Ethan followed the dog's stare. "What is it, buddy?" he asked quietly. Ranger did not look away. The expression in the German shepherd's eyes was different now. Sharper, intentional, as though he had noticed something important, something everyone else had missed. The evening shadows stretched across the valley. The wind whispered through the pine trees. Ethan reached down and rested a hand on Ranger's neck. He had no idea that while the town continued questioning his honor, The one loyal friend who never doubted him had already begun paying attention to the man responsible for everything. 3 days passed, and the town seemed to grow smaller around Ethan Brooks. Not physically, emotionally. Every familiar place carried a different feeling now. The hardware store where people once greeted him warmly. The diner where he knew nearly every face. The small grocery market where conversations used to stretch across entire aisles. Everywhere he went, he felt the change. It lived in the hesitation before a greeting. It lingered in shortened conversations. It appeared in the quick glances people exchanged when they thought he was not looking. Ethan never complained. He never confronted anyone. Each morning he woke before sunrise, fed Ranger, drank his coffee on the porch, and watched the first light touch the mountains. The routine remained unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, something important had shifted. Ranger noticed it too. The German Shepherd rarely left Ethan's side now. If Ethan worked outside, Ranger stayed nearby. If Ethan drove into town, Ranger sat in the passenger seat. If Ethan paused to watch the sunset from the porch, Ranger settled beside him. The dog seemed determined to stand guard against something invisible. One cloudy afternoon, Ethan stopped at the local feed store to pick up supplies. As he loaded bags into the truck, he heard two men talking near the entrance. They lowered their voices when they noticed him. One looked away immediately. The other offered an awkward nod. Ethan simply continued loading the truck. Ranger sat quietly in the back seat watching everything through the window. On the drive home, Ethan kept his eyes on the road. He did not seem angry. He seemed tired. The kind of tiredness that comes when people begin questioning things you know are true. Ranger watched him carefully. The dog sensed changes in mood the way others sensed approaching weather. That evening a cold wind moved through the valley. Pine branches swayed outside the cabin windows. Ethan sat beside the fireplace reading an old book while Ranger rested nearby. Suddenly the German Shepherd lifted his head. His ears stood forward. Every muscle in his body tightened. Ethan looked up. "What is it?" Ranger moved toward the front window. Outside, headlights appeared on the road beyond the property. A dark pickup truck rolled slowly past the cabin. Ethan recognized it immediately. The vehicle belonged to Walter Kane, the man who had accused him at the community center. The truck continued down the road before disappearing behind the trees. Ranger remained at the window long after it vanished. His gaze never wavered. Ethan found the reaction strange. Ranger had seen countless vehicles pass the property before. He never responded like this. Yet whenever Walter appeared, something changed. The next morning brought another unusual moment. Ethan stopped at a small coffee shop near the center of town. Ranger waited outside beside a bench. Through the front window, Ethan noticed Walter walking along the sidewalk across the street. Instantly, Ranger stood up. The German Shepherd's attention locked onto the man. Not aggressive, not fearful, focused, as though studying him. Walter disappeared around the corner. Ranger continued staring at the empty sidewalk for several seconds afterward. Ethan frowned. "You really do not like him, do you?" Ranger finally relaxed, but the question remained in Ethan's mind. Over the next week, the pattern repeated. At the gas station, near the post office, outside town hall. Every time Walter appeared, Ranger reacted. Not with barking or growling. With intense observation. Watching. Tracking. Remembering. It was almost as though the dog recognized something nobody else could see. One afternoon, Ethan drove toward the edge of town to clear his head. Ranger sat beside him as usual. The road wound through open fields beneath a gray sky. They passed an abandoned industrial area that had been closed for years. Rusted fences surrounded several old storage buildings. Most people barely noticed the place anymore. As the truck rolled past, Ranger suddenly sat upright. His ears snapped forward. His entire posture changed. Before Ethan could react, the German Shepherd pressed his nose against the window. His eyes fixed on something beyond the fence. Ethan slowed the truck. Ranger let out a short sound deep in his throat. Not a bark. More like recognition. Ethan followed the dog's stare. Near one of the distant storage buildings sat a familiar dark pickup truck. Walter's truck. The engine was off. No one appeared to be around. Yet Ranger refused to look away. The wind rattled the chain-link fence. Clouds drifted overhead. Ethan studied the old buildings for a long moment. Something about the scene felt important. He could not explain why. But beside him, Ranger seemed absolutely certain. And for the first time since the accusation shattered his quiet life, Ethan felt the faintest sense that the story was not over yet. The image of Walter Kane's truck sitting beside the abandoned storage building stayed with Ethan long after he drove away. That evening, the sky over the valley turned the color of steel. Low clouds drifted across the mountains while cold wind moved through the pine trees surrounding the cabin. Ethan sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. Ranger lay nearby, but unlike most evenings, the German shepherd seemed restless. Every few minutes he lifted his head and looked toward the distant road, the same road that eventually led to the old industrial property. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything about Ranger. Years of partnership had taught him to trust the dog's instincts even when they made no immediate sense. The following morning arrived gray and quiet. Ethan planned to spend the day repairing a section of fence damage during winter storms. Shortly after sunrise, he gathered his tools and headed toward the pasture. Ranger followed as always. For several hours they worked beneath a sky threatening rain. Then something unusual happened. Ranger suddenly stopped helping patrol the fence line. The dog stood motionless, ears forward, staring toward the truck parked near the barn. Ethan leaned against a fence post and watched. "What is it now?" he asked softly. Ranger immediately trotted toward the truck. Ethan expected him to circle the vehicle and return. Instead, the German shepherd stopped beside the driver's door and looked directly at Ethan. When Ethan did not move, Ranger paced in a small circle and returned to the door. Then he looked back again. The message felt unmistakable. "Follow me." Ethan frowned. "You want to go somewhere?" Ranger's tail moved once. The dog immediately returned to the truck. Ethan hesitated only a moment before setting down his tools. 20 minutes later, they were driving toward town. Ranger sat unusually upright in the passenger seat. His eyes remained fixed ahead. He seemed to know exactly where he wanted to go. They passed the diner, the hardware store, the church near the center of town. Then Ranger became alert. Ethan noticed the change instantly. The dog's ears rose. His body leaned slightly forward. A familiar dark pickup truck sat parked outside a small office building. Walter's truck. Ranger watched it closely as they drove by. Ethan continued down the road. "You really are interested in him," he muttered. Ranger never looked away until the truck disappeared behind them. Rather than relaxing, the dog became more focused. Several miles later, they reached the outskirts of town. The abandoned industrial property appeared again beyond a row of overgrown trees. Rusted fencing surrounded a cluster of aging storage buildings. Ranger immediately stood. His front paws pressed against the dashboard. Ethan slowed. "This place." The German shepherd stared through the windshield. Ethan pulled onto the shoulder. Before the truck had fully stopped, Ranger was already waiting at the door. Ethan stepped out into the cool air. The property looked forgotten. Tall weeds pushed through cracked pavement. Rust stained the metal siding of the warehouses. Broken signs hung crookedly from chain-link fences. No vehicles appeared anywhere except one. Walter's dark pickup truck sat near the farthest building, exactly where Ethan had seen it before. Ranger moved toward the fence line. Not rushing, not excited, determined. Ethan followed. The dog led him along the perimeter until they reached a section where the fencing had partially collapsed years earlier. Ranger slipped through the opening and continued toward the buildings. Ethan climbed through after him. The wind rattled loose sheets of metal overhead. Somewhere a door creaked softly. Ranger moved directly toward the largest storage structure near the back of the property. Several units appeared abandoned. Dust covered the windows. Paint peeled from the walls. Yet one building looked different. Tire tracks cut through the dirt leading toward it. The grass nearby had been disturbed recently. Someone still used this place. Ranger stopped beside a side entrance. His nose worked carefully along the bottom of the door. Then he sat down and stared at Ethan. The old military dog had done this before. During searches, during training exercises, during moments when he wanted his handler to notice something important. Ethan slowly approached. The heavy metal door was secured with a chain, but through a narrow window, he could see darkness inside. Nothing else. Ranger remained fixed on the entrance. Not barking, not moving, waiting. Ethan placed one hand against the cold metal surface. For reasons he could not explain, his heartbeat quickened. The accusation that shattered his reputation. Walter's strange behavior. The abandoned property. Ranger's relentless focus. Pieces of a puzzle were beginning to move into place. And standing before that locked building, Ethan felt certain of one thing. Whatever truth Ranger had been trying to show him was hidden somewhere on the other side of that door. The wind whistled softly through gaps in the rusted buildings as Ethan stood beside the locked storage unit. One hand rested against the cold metal door. Ranger sat a few feet away, watching him with unwavering focus. The abandoned property felt strangely alive despite years of neglect. Loose pieces of metal shifted somewhere overhead. Tall weeds swayed along cracked pavement. The scent of dust, rain, and old machinery lingered in the air. Ethan stepped back and studied the structure more carefully. The chain securing the door looked old, but not forgotten. Unlike the surrounding buildings, this one showed signs of recent use. Tire tracks cut through the dirt nearby. The ground around the entrance had been disturbed. Someone had been here recently. Someone wanted access to whatever was inside. Ranger stood and moved toward a side wall. His nose followed the base of the building. Ethan watched as the German Shepherd carefully examined every inch of the structure. Then the dog stopped beside a narrow window partially covered by dirt and cobwebs. Ranger looked inside. Ethan approached and brushed away years of grime from the glass. At first he saw only darkness. Then his eyes adjusted. Rows of shelves appeared inside. Boxes, filing cabinets, stacked containers. Nothing remarkable. Yet something about the arrangement seemed unusual. This was not random storage. It looked organized, deliberate. Ranger pawed gently at the ground beneath the window. Ethan glanced down. Hidden among weeds sat a small object partially buried in the dirt. He crouched and picked it up. A key card, weathered but intact. No name. No markings except a faded logo from a company that had closed nearly a decade earlier. Ethan turned it over in his hand. Ranger immediately focused on it. The dog seemed almost relieved that he had found it. "You knew it was here?" Ethan asked quietly. Ranger's ears twitched. Ethan slipped the card into his pocket. He had no idea whether it mattered, but experience taught him not to ignore small details. The rest of the afternoon passed with more questions than answers. Eventually, Ethan returned home. Yet throughout the evening, he found himself thinking about the storage building. The key card, Walter's truck, Ranger's behavior. Pieces of a puzzle continued gathering around something hidden just beyond view. The next morning brought rain. Gray clouds covered the valley. Water drummed softly against the cabin roof while Ethan sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee. Ranger lay near the fireplace. Suddenly, the German Shepherd stood. He walked directly to the door, then looked back. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Again, Ranger remained there, waiting, determined. The dog had never behaved this way before. Whatever had captured his attention was not fading. Ethan grabbed his jacket. Less than an hour later, they stood once more at the abandoned property. Rain fell steadily across the rusted buildings. The storage unit looked even more isolated beneath the stormy sky. Ethan removed the key card from his pocket and approached the side entrance. Near the doorframe sat a small electronic panel hidden beneath years of dust. He stared at it for several seconds, then looked at the card. Slowly, he inserted it into the slot. Nothing happened. For a moment, disappointment settled over him. Then a faint green light flickered. A quiet click echoed from inside the door. Ethan froze. Ranger immediately stood. The lock had released. The old metal door opened with a long creak. Cool air drifted from the darkness inside. Ethan switched on a flashlight and stepped across the threshold. Ranger entered first. Dust floated through the beam of light. Shelves lined the walls exactly as Ethan had seen through the window. Filing cabinets stood neatly arranged near the back. Plastic containers filled with documents occupied several tables. The room felt less like a storage unit and more like an archive, a place where someone had been preserving information for years. Ranger moved deeper inside. He passed rows of shelves without hesitation, then stopped beside a gray filing cabinet tucked into a corner. The German Shepherd sat down and stared at it. Ethan's pulse quickened. Slowly he approached. One drawer stood slightly open. He pulled it farther. Inside rested dozens of folders organized alphabetically. Most contained names Ethan did not recognize. Then he saw one that made his breath catch. Walter Kane. Ethan removed the folder carefully. Dust coated the cover. The file appeared thick, much thicker than the others. Ranger remained seated beside the cabinet, waiting, watching. As Ethan opened the folder, he realized he was no longer searching for answers. He was standing at the edge of the truth. The folder felt heavier than paper should have felt. Ethan carried it to an old metal table near the center of the storage room, while Ranger settled beside his chair. Rain tapped softly against the roof overhead. Dust drifted through the beam of his flashlight. For a moment, he simply stared at the cover. Walter Kane. The name seemed ordinary, yet somehow it had become connected to every question hanging over his life. Ethan opened the folder slowly. The first pages contained property records, business documents, and correspondence stretching back nearly 15 years. At first, nothing appeared remarkable. Then he noticed a pattern. Several documents carried conflicting information. Dates did not match. Signatures appeared inconsistent. Some pages referenced meetings and projects that never seemed to have existed. Ethan leaned closer. The deeper he read, the stranger the file became. Ranger remained unusually attentive. The German shepherd watched every movement, as if he understood the importance of what was unfolding. Ethan turned another page and discovered a series of newspaper clippings carefully preserved inside plastic sleeves. Most featured Walter. Community awards, fundraising events, public recognition, photographs with local leaders, stories celebrating achievements that had supposedly helped the town prosper. Ethan frowned. Why would someone store years of public praise inside a hidden storage unit? Then he found the notes attached behind them. Typed summaries, corrections, contradictions, anonymous statements, financial records, questions that had apparently never been investigated. The picture growing before him was unsettling. It appeared someone had spent years documenting inconsistencies surrounding Walter's public reputation. Ethan sat back and rubbed a hand across his face. The room suddenly felt smaller. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the distant hills. He continued reading. Several folders inside the larger file contained correspondence between former business partners. Others included copies of legal filings. None of it directly explained why Walter had targeted him. Yet a single theme emerged repeatedly. Walter seemed obsessed with recognition, with status, with controlling how others perceived him. Ethan closed the folder briefly and stared across the dark room. Ranger stood and approached another cabinet nearby. His nose touched one of the lower drawers. Then he looked back at Ethan. The same look, the same quiet insistence. Ethan rose and walked over. He opened the drawer. Inside rested several small storage boxes neatly labeled by year. Most appeared untouched for a long time. One box near the front looked newer. Ethan lifted it onto the table. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, community events, fundraisers, public ceremonies, local celebrations. Walter appeared in many of them, often standing near the center of attention. Ethan sorted through the stack carefully. Then one photograph stopped him cold. It showed a veteran's fundraiser from years earlier. Walter stood near a decorated guest speaker. Ethan recognized the man immediately. He had served with military charities across several states. Attached to the back of the photograph was a handwritten note. Ethan read it twice, then a third time. The note suggested Walter had falsely claimed involvement in projects he never actually supported. Ethan's pulse quickened. Another photograph revealed a similar pattern. Then another. Then another. The evidence was not dramatic. It was something more powerful, consistent. Years of small deceptions carefully documented by someone who had clearly wanted the truth preserved. Ranger remained beside the table. His tail rested motionless against the floor. The dog seemed calmer now, almost satisfied, as though they were finally approaching whatever destination he had been guiding Ethan toward. Near the bottom of the box, Ethan discovered a sealed envelope. No address, no stamp, only a handwritten message across the front. If necessary, let the facts speak for themselves. Ethan carefully opened it. Inside rested a flash drive and a folded letter. The letter explained that the storage unit had been maintained by a former investigator who had spent years collecting records regarding public misconduct and false claims made by several influential figures. Most cases had never required action. The evidence had simply been preserved. Walter's file, however, continued growing. Ethan read every line slowly. One sentence caught his attention more than any other. It mentioned documented examples of Walter falsely questioning the credibility of others whenever he feared losing influence within the community. Ethan lowered the letter. The room fell silent except for the rain. Suddenly, the accusation at the community center felt less random, less personal, more calculated. Ethan looked at Ranger. The German shepherd gazed back with steady amber eyes. For weeks, the dog had noticed something no one else had seen. While the town focused on accusations, Ranger had focused on behavior, on patterns, on a man who kept appearing where answers seemed hidden. Ethan reached down and rested a hand on the dog's neck. The familiar warmth grounded him. Outside, the storm began to weaken. Light filtered faintly through the dirty windows. For the first time since his reputation had been questioned, Ethan felt something returning. Not certainty, not victory, something quieter. Hope, because sitting on that dusty table were not rumors, not opinions, not accusations. They were facts. And facts, unlike gossip, had a way of surviving long after the noise faded. The storm had passed by the time Ethan and Ranger returned to the cabin. Sunlight broke through scattered clouds and painted the mountains in shades of gold. Yet Ethan barely noticed the view. The folders, photographs, letters, and records occupied the kitchen table. Every page seemed to reveal another piece of a story nobody in town had ever seen. Ranger lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, watching quietly as Ethan worked late into the evening. The retired Navy SEAL moved through the documents with patient focus. Years of training had taught him something important. Facts mattered. Details mattered. Patterns mattered. The truth often hid inside small things people overlooked. Midnight arrived. Then 1 o'clock. Still, Ethan continued reading. Finally, he reached a collection of records stored on the flash drive found inside the envelope. Old emails, archive correspondence, meeting notes, financial reports. The deeper he searched, the clearer the picture became. Walter Kane had spent years carefully building an image of himself as a respected community leader. Most of it appeared genuine. Yet woven through the records were repeated examples of exaggeration, false claims, and deliberate attempts to take credit for achievements belonging to others. Ethan leaned back in his chair. The realization felt strangely sad rather than satisfying. He had expected anger. Instead, he felt disappointment. The man who had publicly accused him seemed driven by something far smaller than hatred. Insecurity. The next morning sunlight streamed through the cabin windows. Ethan stepped onto the porch carrying a mug of coffee. Ranger followed immediately. Cool mountain air filled the valley. Birds moved between the pine trees. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt calm. Not because his problems were solved, because he finally understood what he was facing. Later that afternoon, he visited the county library. Ranger waited patiently outside while Ethan met with an old friend named Margaret Collins. She had spent years preserving local records and historical archives. If anyone could help verify the documents, it was her. Margaret studied the material carefully. The longer she examined it, the more serious her expression became. "These records appear authentic," she said quietly. "Very authentic." Ethan nodded. "That is what I thought." Margaret removed her glasses and looked directly at him. "If this information is accurate, someone has been hiding the truth for a very long time." Ethan left the library carrying a growing sense of certainty. He was no longer relying on suspicion. Independent verification had begun confirming what the documents suggested. Over the next several days, additional pieces fell into place. Former business associates mentioned incidents matching information found in the files. Archived newspaper records supported several discrepancies. Public statements conflicted with documented timelines. None of it alone proved anything extraordinary. Together, they formed something impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Ranger remained unusually attentive whenever Walter appeared anywhere in town. One afternoon, Ethan spotted Walter speaking with several residents outside a hardware store. The moment Ranger saw him, the German shepherd stopped walking. His gaze locked onto the man. Ethan watched carefully. Walter smiled, shook hands, told stories. Everything appeared normal. Yet Ethan now viewed the scene differently. He recognized the confidence, the performance, the need for admiration hidden beneath every gesture. Ranger stood silently beside him. The dog had noticed something weeks before Ethan ever found the storage unit. Not evidence, not documents. Behavior, character, instinct had led him where facts eventually followed. That evening, Ethan organized everything into a single binder. Verified records, supporting documents, witness statements, historical archives, correspondence. By the time he finished, the binder sat nearly 4 inches thick on the table. Ranger rested nearby as always. Ethan looked at the dog and smiled faintly. "You knew something was wrong long before I did." Ranger lifted his head. His amber eyes reflected the warm light from the fireplace. Outside, darkness settled across the valley. The town remained unaware of what was coming. Most people still believed the accusation made weeks earlier. Some continued questioning Ethan's past. Others simply avoided the subject. None of them knew that the story was about to change. Because hidden inside a forgotten storage building, preserved by years of careful documentation, lay evidence capable of exposing the real fraud. And thanks to one loyal German shepherd who refused to ignore what he sensed, the truth was finally preparing to step into the light. The notice appeared on a Monday morning. A special community meeting would be held at the town hall that Friday evening. Residents were encouraged to attend. Local leaders described it as an opportunity to address recent concerns and restore trust within the community. By Tuesday, nearly everyone was talking about it. Some expected Ethan Brooks to finally defend himself. Others assumed the controversy would quietly disappear. Ethan made no public statements. He continued his daily routine exactly as before. He repaired fences, walked forest trails with Ranger, drank coffee on the porch each morning while sunlight climbed across the mountains. Yet inside the cabin, preparations continued. The binder containing months and years of documented evidence sat carefully organized on the kitchen table. Every page had been verified, every record checked, every claim supported by facts. Ranger remained close throughout the week. The German shepherd seemed calmer now. The intense focus that had driven him toward the storage unit had gradually faded. It was as if he understood that his part of the mission was nearly complete. Friday arrived beneath clear autumn skies. Golden leaves drifted across sidewalks as people gathered outside town hall. Vehicles filled the parking lot long before the meeting began. Families arrived together. Business owners stood in small groups discussing rumors. Retirees occupied benches near the entrance. Curiosity hung over the crowd like an approaching storm. Inside, folding chairs filled the large meeting room. The atmosphere felt remarkably similar to the night everything began. The same walls, the same stage, the same community. Yet this time the energy was different. People seemed uneasy, unsure, waiting. Ethan entered quietly through the rear doors. Ranger walked beside him. Conversations softened as heads turned. Some people offered polite nods. Others avoided eye contact. Ethan simply moved toward an empty seat near the front. Ranger settled beside him. A few rows away sat Walter King, confident, relaxed, smiling occasionally as he greeted familiar faces. He appeared completely comfortable. The meeting began shortly after sunset. Local officials discussed community projects and routine matters first. Then the mayor stood and addressed the room. Several weeks ago, serious accusations were made publicly, he said. Tonight we have an opportunity to discuss those concerns openly and respectfully. Silence settled over the hall. Walter rose first. He repeated many of the same claims he had made before. Questions, doubts, suspicions. He spoke confidently. Several people nodded along. Others listened without expression. When he finished, the mayor turned toward Ethan. Would you like to respond? For a moment the room remained perfectly still. Ethan slowly stood. Ranger lifted his head but remained seated. Ethan carried the binder to the front of the room and placed it on a table beneath the stage lights. He looked across the audience. Familiar faces stared back. Friends, neighbors, people he had known for years. Then he opened the binder. What followed lasted nearly an hour. Ethan did not argue. He did not attack anyone. He simply presented facts, verified records, archived documents, public statements compared against official timelines, photographs, correspondence, independent confirmations. Piece by piece, a different story emerged. A story not about Ethan. A story about Walter. The room grew quieter with every page. Expressions changed. Doubt shifted direction. The evidence revealed repeated patterns stretching back years. Exaggerated accomplishments. Misleading claims. Attempts to undermine others when attention shifted away from him. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sensational. Just a long record of small dishonesties preserved through careful documentation. Walter's confidence began fading. His smile disappeared. Several times he attempted to interrupt. Each time another document answered the objection before it could gain momentum. People who had supported him sat in stunned silence. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Near the back of the room someone whispered, "I cannot believe this." Another shook his head slowly. By the time Ethan reached the final section of evidence, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The same room that once questioned his honor now sat speechless before the truth. Ethan closed the binder. He did not celebrate. He did not appear angry. He simply stepped back from the table. The mayor looked across the audience. No one spoke. No one seemed able to. Facts had accomplished what arguments never could. Walter remained seated. His shoulders sagged. For the first time all evening, he avoided looking at the crowd. Ranger quietly rose and walked to Ethan's side. The German shepherd sat beside him, calm and dignified. Together they faced the room. The silence felt different now. Not suspicion, not judgment, understanding. Outside, evening settled gently over the town. Inside, years of deception had finally encountered something stronger than rumor. The truth. And as Ethan rested one hand on Ranger's shoulder, he realized that the loyal friend beside him had seen the path toward that truth long before anyone else. The days following the town hall meeting felt strangely quiet. Not because people had stopped talking, because the truth had finally replaced speculation. Autumn sunlight filled the valley each morning. Golden leaves drifted from the trees. Cool air carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Life continued moving forward, but something important had changed. Ethan Brooks noticed it first at the diner. The same place that had fallen silent when he entered weeks earlier now felt familiar again. People greeted him. Some offered apologies. Others simply smiled. No grand speeches. No dramatic gestures. Just small acts of respect returning one by one. Ethan accepted them with the same quiet grace he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. He never spoke badly about Walter. He never celebrated being proven right. He simply continued living his life. Ranger seemed to sense the difference too. The German shepherd no longer watched every room with intense focus. The tension that had followed him for weeks had disappeared. His work was finished. One crisp Saturday morning, a letter arrived from the town council. Ethan opened it while sitting on the porch. Ranger rested nearby beneath the warm sunlight. The letter invited him to attend a special community gathering the following weekend. The purpose was simple: to recognize integrity, service, and the values that helped hold a community together. Ethan read the invitation twice before setting it down. He smiled faintly. Ranger lifted his head as if asking a question. "Looks like we are going to town again, buddy." The German shepherd's tail thumped softly against the wooden porch. The following Saturday arrived bright and clear. Families gathered in the town square beneath rows of American flags gently moving in the breeze. Children played near the fountain. Local musicians performed beneath a gazebo. The atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. Ethan parked near the edge of the square and stepped out of the truck. Ranger immediately joined him. As they walked through the crowd, people stopped to greet them. Some shook Ethan's hand. Others bent down to pet Ranger. Many thanked him for his patience and dignity during difficult weeks. Ethan responded with the same humble nod he always offered. The ceremony began shortly before noon. Chairs filled quickly. Community leaders stood near a small stage decorated with autumn flowers and local flags. The mayor stepped forward and addressed the crowd. He spoke about honesty, about trust, about the importance of facts over rumors. Then he invited Ethan to join him on stage. Applause spread across the square. Ethan hesitated briefly before walking forward. Ranger remained at his side. The applause grew louder as they approached. Yet the moment never felt like a celebration of victory. It felt like something gentler. Restoration. The mayor presented Ethan with a simple plaque recognizing years of service to both country and community. Nothing extravagant. Nothing dramatic. Just sincere appreciation. Then something unexpected happened. Before returning to his seat, Ethan looked down at Ranger. The crowd followed his gaze. For several seconds no one spoke. Everyone seemed to understand the same thing. Without Ranger, none of this would have happened. The loyal German shepherd had noticed what others missed. He had followed instinct when everyone else followed assumptions. He had led Ethan toward the truth without ever speaking a single word. The mayor smiled. "I believe there is another member of this community who deserves recognition today." Laughter and applause rippled through the crowd. A volunteer stepped forward carrying a custom-made collar tag engraved with a simple message: "For loyalty beyond words." The tag was attached gently to Ranger's collar. The German shepherd sat calmly while cameras flashed and children cheered. Ethan looked down at his old friend. For the first time in weeks, emotion reached his eyes. Not because his reputation had been restored. Not because the town now understood the truth. Because the one companion who never doubted him was finally receiving the gratitude he deserved. Later that evening, the celebration faded into memory. The sun dipped behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the valley. Ethan and Ranger returned to the cabin as they always did. The world felt peaceful again. After dinner, Ethan stepped onto the porch carrying 2 cups. One held coffee, the other held fresh water. Ranger settled beside him. Together they watched the final light disappear beyond the pine-covered ridges. The valley glowed beneath a sky filled with stars. The wind moved gently through the trees. Ethan reached down and rested a hand on Ranger's neck. Neither needed words. Some truths were bigger than explanations. Some friendships were stronger than doubt. And sometimes honor survives not because people defend it loudly, but because one loyal dog refuses to let the truth stay hidden. Beneath the quiet Montana sky, man and dog sat side by side. The storm had passed. The truth had been found. And at last, both of them were exactly where they belonged.